money and expect to get a return. But the federal government had a political purpose in mind. Of course, ranchers loved it. Give us subsidized land. Give us subsidized grazing territory. So again, what you're doing is you're finding in cases like this is taxpayers are losing and the environment's losing. You're getting development that otherwise shouldn't be occurring. And there are a lot of areas where you see that kind of activity. I mean, if you go back to Hurricane Katrina, the question of development in New Orleans, you look at the Barrier Islands, the questions of flood insurance. The federal government is engaged in a lot of policies that basically pay people to build in floodplains. That's not very good policy. I mean, much of the Barrier Islands probably would not be developed were it not for flood insurance. I mean, we can predict with a certain regularity of how often hurricanes will float in and wipe things out. Now, if you want to go out there and build a house and take a risk, 1/5 the risk is going to be blown away every year, I say fine, go to it. But if you can kind of hand the bill to the taxpayers, it kind of transforms the whole incentive structure. We have a policy that tends to encourage people to build in fragile environmental areas that are dangerous where they shouldn't be building. You look at an issue like Brazilian rainforest, and you can find some of these international issues. One of the problems you see with a lot of overseas development is for years it was funded by the international development agencies. World Bank in particular, there are 4 regional development banks, the IMF, which is somewhat different in the kind of loans that it makes, but money's fungible. You have this massive amount of money going in, funded by Western taxpayers, which traditionally has supported development projects in many authoritarian countries. Peasants get kicked off their land, inadequate environmental controls. Places like Brazil, you have inadequate property rights for indigenous peoples. The question is, how do you assert property rights, and kind of hold on to them when miners show up and they're subsidized by international agencies? So you've seen some of these same problems abroad. Now, private institutions can make mistakes with the environment. I mean, corporations and individuals can do really dumb and bad things. But government is uniquely impervious to many of the accountability mechanisms that matter for most companies and most individuals. I think of toxic waste policy. I mean, Love Canal, became kind of quite a cause celeb in New York and around the country. I mean, toxic waste dump, Hooker Chemical. Kind of the perceived wisdom was it's this evil chemical company. But the point is, if you make chemicals, you have byproducts. What Hooker Chemical did, there was a Reason magazine, 10, 20 years ago, did a very long, detailed study of this issue. Looked at all the court documents, meetings of government agencies. What they laid out was, Hooker Chemical shows up and builds this, kind of digs a big hole, puts in clay, creates a state-of-the-art containment, and then it dumps chemical wastes in there, fills it up, puts clay on top, plants grass. So you have this big area. Well, the school board showed up to Hooker Chemical and said, we'd like to have that land. Hooker Chemical said, well, it's really not appropriate for building on. The school board threatened to take it through eminent domain. So Hooker Chemical provided a quitclaim deed and said, fine, it's yours. They even sent lawyers to a couple of meetings to remind the school board you shouldn't build on this. Well, Hooker Chemical sold off the land to developers. The question is, what do developers do? They dig. Well, if you dig into a toxic waste dump, guess what happens? By the time this happened, I mean, the school board members who kind of started this whole process, they're off the board. They're not held accountable. Hooker Chemical never could have sold that off to private developers because they would have been held legally liable. You had a very different incentive structure in terms of the political folks who could use the power of the law to grab the land and do with it what they wanted versus folks who would have been held legally liable. You get into problems, of midnight dumping with toxic waste. You get problems, companies go out bankrupt. The government, I think, has a role in cases like that in trying to deal with these issues. But I think it's just important to keep in mind the incentive structure there. What's critical is accountability. And government, unfortunately, has a tendency not to be accountable. And that makes it a very poor environmental standard steward at times. You look at government's own environmental record on defense bases, you look at even some of the EPA labs, you look at Hanford and nuclear facilities of the federal government, awful stuff, years and years, to try to get the federal government to clean up its own act. So the political process is not a particularly good one if one is concerned about trying to protect environmental values. There's a second set, and I think it kind of looms larger these days in terms of how politics plays in, and I would argue gives us a bad balance in terms of environmental policy. And that's basically encouraging people to use scare tactics to pursue environmental ends. There are a lot of issues out there that are quite legitimate and deserve to be debated. The question is, how do you get political attention? We have a process that tends to focus on 30-second TV spots, and it biases the discussion I would argue, away from reasonable scientific discourse and towards something very different. Back in 1989, the Natural Resources Defense Council hired a PR firm to lead a campaign against ALAR, which is a pesticide. And this is one of these issues that's been kind of ongoing controversy over the years. It's based upon a study of rats that using very high concentrations of ALAR, getting cancer, trying to decide what that impact was in terms of human beings using it. Well, what they went out, they got to Meryl Streep, kind of lead the campaign, got lots of PR attention, and got basically ALAR knocked off the market. Now, it's an issue where some people today say that was great, because kind of retrospectively we think ALAR was a bad thing. But what you found at the time were a lot of people, UN panels, California Department of Agriculture, and scientists saying, they didn't see this as being a high risk of cancer. But if you kind of looked at it, the problem is the battle was being fought out in PR terms, where the discussion really was not scientific into something very different. The Fenton Communications, which was the PR firm, actually did up a memo that it circulated to activist groups saying, this is how we did it. Got lots of media attention. Got to scare people. I mean, this is the way you've got to frame the issue. It's very hard if you frame issues that way to get good environmental results. One of the ways we have a kind of relative risk assessment, we have a tendency to focus on man-made and ignore natural. And the question is, what's worse? Well, nature itself has natural pesticides. The estimate is that your risk of cancer from all the pesticides on the residue on the food you eat in one day is about 1/20th the risk of getting cancer from the natural carcinogens in a cup of coffee. Now, coffee is not likely to give you cancer. It's a question of relative risk. Very few people are out there campaigning to ban coffee as this dangerous carcinogen. Nevertheless, if you're thinking about relative risk and what's relatively more dangerous, we have a tendency to focus on things which aren't as important. Another one is acid rain. This is an issue back in 1980. There were kind of predictions about a massive increase in acid rain, destruction of forests, destruction of lakes. It became a very hot political issue in 1990 with the reauthorization of the Clean Air Act. Congress added an SO2 abatement program, which actually has tradable permits, which is a sensible way of trying to deal with air pollution problems. It's a good kind of market-oriented approach. Nevertheless, and indeed there are good arguments for lowering SO2 emissions, but acid rain probably was not the good argument. Congress eventually set up a $500 million study, the National Acid Precipitation Assessment Project. And what it found was that in the Northeast, only about 3.5% of lakes were considered to be critically acidic. They found most of the acidic lakes were down in Florida, yet the rain was less acidic there. And there's a problem in the mechanism. They found that that on average, lakes today were no more acidic than they were before the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Well, if you're arguing that pollution is causing the additional SO2, the SO2 is what's causing the acid to fall and destroying forests and lakes, you should be having a lot more acidity today than before. What they found indeed was a very complex scientific issue where it wasn't at all clear that the SO2 connection to acid rain is the real issue. But it had very little impact on the political debate. I mean, it shows the importance of language. I mean, to call something acid rain essentially gives away the debate almost there. Who can defend acid rain? I mean, who can try to argue acid rain isn't the problem? Just the name, the sound, is almost enough. Whereas the big issue that we're facing today, and the very complex one, this is highly complex, is global warming, the question of climate change. Now, the evidence, I think, is extraordinarily strong that there is warming. I think that's happened. The problem is, you can say that, and there's still a lot of issues that are very complex, and it's also an issue that has been highly politicized. You look up into the basically 1970s, 1980s, people were not concerned about global warming. They were concerned about a different potential catastrophe. And I like to go to used bookstores and pick up old books and old magazines. And I found a National Geographic from 1976 that quotes Dr. Murray Mitchell of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a federal agency. And Dr. Mitchell announced since about